Welcome everyone to the NutriAthletics 3-day webinar series. Today is the third and final day of the series, so I will be talking about macronutrients and micronutrients. And I'm sure you guys already know me by now, but I'm just going to introduce myself once again. My name is Kyle Zhao, and I'll be a high school senior next year. I created NutriAthletics this past summer as a blog site to share what I've learned about nutrition and exercise this past summer and also over the past 2 years. And now I'm finishing up this webinar series to provide another way to share what I know and to inspire other people to value nutrition and exercise the way that I do, because they're so important to our health. Okay, so first I'm going to do an introduction to macronutrients. So as the name implies, macronutrients, those are the nutrients that make up our diet in large quantities. I'm sure you've seen a lot of food labels, and you probably know some of these micronutrients based on the quantity that you see they make up in different foods that we eat every day. And their main function is to provide energy to the body, which is important for everyone, obviously, to perform different activities throughout the day, but especially it's vital for athletes to make sure that they have the macronutrients that they need for their exercise and sports. So I'm going to be talking about 3 macronutrients today. Does anyone know any examples? If you think you do, feel free to unmute yourself or type it into the chat. I'll just wait for a couple seconds to see if anyone wants to answer. All right. So Tony said protein, carbs, and fat. Let's see what I have on this slide. Carbohydrates, fat, and protein. So good job, Tony. You got all 3 of them. These are the macronutrients that I'm going to be talking about today. And yeah, let's get started with that. All right, so to start off, carbohydrates are one of the best energy sources for our body. They have an energetic value of 4 kilocalories per gram, which means that for each gram of carbs we eat, we receive 4 kilocalories of energy. Carbohydrates can be divided into digestible and non-digestible carbs. Non-digestible carbs are also known as fiber. You've probably seen them on food labels before. They help us with our digestion process, but because they're non-digestible, we can't absorb them with our body, which means that we can't receive energy from them. However, the other carbs are called digestible carbs, and they do help us receive energy because we can absorb them into our body and our muscles. So the process after we consume carbs, it's broken down into the building blocks, the small building blocks called glucose, and then they're transferred through the bloodstream to be stored in the muscle and liver as glycogen. The RDA, which is the recommended dietary allowance for daily intake of carbs, is 45 to 65% of your total calories. So usually, if we look at a standard diet for an adult, it's about 2,000 calories. So that translates to about 225 to 325 grams. The way that you can calculate this is knowing that you can calculate how much is 45 to 65% of the total calories, and then divide that by 4 because you know that each gram of carbs contributes 4 kilocalories of energy. So some examples of carbs, foods with carbs that we eat often throughout our diet. We have bread, rice, bananas, and other fruits as well, and sweet potatoes. Next, I'm going to be talking about fat, which is the second macronutrient. So the first thing to know is that fat is another great energy source that our body uses. Its energetic value is 9 kilocalories per gram. So this is significantly higher than the energetic value of carbohydrates. It's more than twice we receive twice the amount of energy from a single gram of a single gram of fat compared to a single gram of carbs. It has a couple different types. The most general division we can talk about is saturated and unsaturated. Does anyone know which of these two is considered the healthier fat? If you do, you can type it into the chat. All right. Yeah. Okay. So Miss Gal, Evan, and Tony, they all said unsaturated is healthier, and that's correct. And saturated is worse than unsaturated because it may increase the levels of LDL in your body. LDL stands for low density lipoprotein, which is also called bad cholesterol. And the reason it's called bad cholesterol is because studies have shown that it might increase your risk of heart disease. So that's why it's advised that you want to obviously eat the right amount of fat per day, but the more unsaturated fats you have and the less saturated fats you have, the better it will be for your health. So basically, it's advised to try to fill up your diet with fats that are unsaturated instead of saturated in order to avoid the potential risks of having too many saturated fats. So when you consume fat in your diet, they're broken down into fatty acids and glycerol, and then they are absorbed by the intestine. And then finally, they're stored in the adipose tissue, where from there, if you need the fats during exercise, they will be taken out from the adipose tissue. The recommended daily allowance for fat is 20 to 35% of calories. So for a 2,000 calorie diet, that translates to about 44 to 78 grams of fat. So you can see that although the fat has a greater energetic value than carbs, the number of grams of fat that we should be eating every day is not nearly as much as the number of grams of carbs. So although we know that fat provides more energy per gram, that doesn't mean we should be just trying to eat as many grams of fat as possible to get the most energy, because we should be sticking to the recommended dietary allowances that we have available to us. Some examples of foods with fat include nuts, eggs, cheese, and avocado. Next, I'll be talking about protein. So protein has a variety of functions in our body. It helps our body with growth, maintenance, and protection. However, beyond that, it also does contribute some energy for our daily activities. It has an energetic value of 4 kilocalories per gram, which is the same amount as the energetic value of carbs. Its building blocks are called amino acids, which are linked together in long chains to create full proteins. It's also proteins can also, oh, not proteins, amino acids can be split up into essential versus non-essential amino acids. The difference is that essential amino acids cannot be synthesized or produced by our bodies. That means we have to receive these essential amino acids from our diet via protein sources. In total, there are 20 amino acids and 9 of them are essential. And I'll talk a little bit more about essential amino acids in a later slide. Furthermore, protein can be split up into animal protein or plant-based protein. Generally, it seems like animal protein is more effective for athletes who want to focus on enhancing their muscle mass or muscle function, because animal protein does often have more essential amino acids to help with protein synthesis, which I'll talk about later. Protein synthesis is basically what you have to know if you want to. You have to know about protein synthesis because it helps your muscles grow and to keep them functioning properly. At the same time, though, it's also important to consume plant-based protein because we want to have a variety of sources from which we get our macronutrients, and we don't want to limit them to a very select group of foods. So when you digest proteins, they go to your stomach and intestine where they're absorbed, and then they are delivered to the organs and tissues for them to be used. So here's some foods with protein in them. So steak, among some other meat products, fish, eggs, and milk. Before I talk about protein synthesis, I just wanted to briefly mention how some of these macronutrients serve as energy sources. I talked about this in yesterday's webinar and slightly in the first one, but I'm going to mention a bit of new information here that I didn't mention before. So when we consume carbs, they're stored as glycogen in our muscles, and when we need them for energy, they're taken out of these stores and they enter either an anaerobic or aerobic pathway to produce energy. Anaerobic basically means without using oxygen to produce energy, while aerobic means involving oxygen. Because there's these two different pathways that carbs can take to produce energy, the exercise that can use carbs as energy includes both anaerobic exercise and high intensity aerobic exercise. So some examples of these would be weightlifting and sprinting. Both of these are anaerobic and they're also high intensity, which is suitable to use carbs as energy because we know that they can use either anaerobic or aerobic pathway to produce energy. However, one of the downsides of carbs is that they have limited stores in our body. So we can't rely on carbs to fuel us for hours of exercise. For example, if you're running like a long marathon or something, you can't be relying on carbs to keep you going at a high intensity for the entire time. So that's why that's why carbs are ideal for shorter duration exercises of higher intensity, like the weightlifting and sprinting examples. Um, Another thing that we have to remember about this is that because we have limited storage of carbs in our body, if we're performing high intensity exercise, we have to be making sure that we're making a full recovery afterwards. And you recover by focusing on consuming enough carbohydrates after your exercise. Because if you perform a high intensity exercise, you used up a lot of the stored glycogen in your muscles, and then they'll be depleted afterwards. And you need energy to go back to exercise maybe the day or the second day after that. So you have to make sure that you are still consuming your carbs after your high intensity exercise. Next, I'll talk about fat as energy. So as we know, fatty acids are stored in adipose tissue underneath our skin or around our organs. And when we need them for energy, they're transported to our muscles. What's different between fats and carbs when they're used to make energy is that fat can only use an aerobic pathway to produce energy. So carbohydrates could use either anaerobic or aerobic. Fats can only use aerobic. This means that the exercise that's suitable for using fat as energy would be low intensity aerobic exercise. So weightlifting and sprinting aren't really examples of exercises that use fat that mainly rely on fat as energy because they're not low intensity and they're not mainly aerobic exercises. However, some endurance exercise like running a long race or cycling long distances does mainly rely on fat as energy because it is a low intensity aerobic exercise. One of the benefits of fat as energy is that it has large stores in our body, which allows it to be providing us with energy for a longer period of time. Someone who goes on a very long run at low intensity is able to rely on fat, even if they go for over an hour or 2 hours of exercise because of these large stores. Next, I'm going to be talking about protein synthesis and protein breakdown, which is an extremely important topic, especially for athletes who prioritize increasing their muscle mass and maintaining their muscle function. So skeletal muscle protein synthesis is basically when amino acids are synthesized and put together to create new muscle proteins. And this is basically what causes your muscles to grow when you have high levels of protein synthesis in your skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscle protein breakdown is the opposite process. It's when muscle proteins are broken down back to their building blocks of amino acids. So the central driving force, obviously, of protein synthesis, which is what you want to focus on if you want to increase your muscle mass, you have to prioritize the protein in your meals. The reason that this is important is because when you consume foods with protein, the protein is broken down into amino acids, and then these amino acids are taken to your muscles where they can stimulate protein synthesis. Now back to the topic of essential amino acids. Essential amino acids are those that we have to have from the diet because our body does not synthesize them by itself. Specifically, some of these essential amino acids are called branched chain amino acids, and these are the ones that are known for being the best at stimulating protein synthesis. And specifically, leucine is the amino acid that's known for being the strongest stimulator of protein synthesis. So right after we eat a meal, obviously protein synthesis levels are high and breakdown levels are really pretty low. So that means that we have a net positive protein balance. However, hours after we eat, once all of our protein is digested and absorbed, we have a net negative protein balance because breakdown starts to increase and synthesis starts to go down. So if you look at in the long term, you have periods of both gains and losses because right after you finish eating a meal, you have a net positive period, and then hours after, when it's all absorbed, it's a net negative period. And then once you go back to eat again, it goes back to positive, negative. So basically, if you're just eating normal three meals a day and going throughout the days like that, you'll experience gains, and then those will be countered by losses. So at the end, you don't really have any net change in protein synthesis or breakdown, and then the muscle mass is pretty constant. So one of the methods of making sure that protein synthesis is enhanced is by consuming protein after you exercise. So when you exercise, your muscles experience protein breakdown, and then immediately afterwards, they begin protein synthesis. And our goal for if we want to enhance protein synthesis would be to consume protein after exercise so that this period of protein synthesis is stronger and more dominant than the breakdown that we experience during exercise. This is known as a synergistic effect. It basically describes just the idea of how nutrition and exercise, so consuming protein and then performing exercise, they work together to enhance and optimize our levels of protein synthesis. A little bit more on consuming protein with exercise. The recommended dietary allowance for a healthy adult is to consume about 0.35 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So for a 140-pound individual, that translates to about 49 grams of protein per day. However, if you're an athlete, you probably have higher protein needs, not just protein, but in general, you have other higher needs for other macronutrients. So this RDA is slightly higher. It's at 0.55 to 0.9 grams per pound of body weight. So a 140-pound athlete would want to consume about 77 to 126 grams of protein in one day. And the reason that there's such a wide range for athletes' RDA is because there's a wide range of sports and exercise that athletes can perform. So depending on the type of sport you do, you might have a different need for protein consumption. So if you are an endurance athlete, you probably want to be aiming for the lower end of the spectrum. And if you're a power strength athlete, you would aim for the higher end of the spectrum. So for example, if you're a long distance runner, you probably want to shoot for about 0.55 grams per pound of body weight. And then if you're like a weightlifter, you would go for 0.9 grams per pound of body weight. I had a question in the chat. RDA stands for recommended dietary allowance. That's basically the recommended amount of a certain macronutrient that we should be consuming each day. And then here I have it according to your body weight. So it varies between individuals. So like I mentioned, it's important to consume protein after exercise if you want to have a net positive protein balance and have protein synthesis dominate the protein breakdown. Specifically, 15 to 25 grams seems to be the optimal range of protein to consume after exercise. To get more specific, the ideal conversion to see how much you should consume based on your body weight is 0.15 grams per pound. So if you're a 140-pound individual, that's about 19 grams of high-quality protein after exercise. Now, high-quality protein basically means protein sources that have all or almost all of the essential amino acids. Like remember, we know that essential amino acids have to come from our diet. So the more essential amino acids we have in our protein source, the higher the quality. Some examples would be whey and casein. These proteins can be found in various food sources such as Greek yogurt and some protein powders. So those are just two easy ways to consume this high quality protein after exercise. Now I'm going to shift over to the second topic to wrap up this webinar, micronutrients. So like the name implies, micronutrients are the nutrients that we consume and we need in only small amounts. So these would be like vitamins and minerals. And because we consume them in such small amounts, specifically even less than 1 gram per day, their role is not to supply us with energy. That's mainly the role of the macronutrients. But the micronutrients are still important for our diet because they help us maintain our normal health and body functions. So here are some foods with that I'll talk about and their micronutrient content. So the meat products, they have iron and vitamin B6. Fruits have vitamin C. Green leafy vegetables have vitamin B11 and magnesium. And dairy products have calcium and vitamin B2. And now I'll be talking about some specific functions of these micronutrients. So start off with iron. Iron is an essential mineral that's main function is to help with oxygen transport. So when we consume iron in our diet, it's built into our red blood cells, and then this allows them to deliver oxygen from our lungs to our muscles, which is very important because in some exercise, specifically lower intensity exercise, we need oxygen in our muscles to help us produce energy. Some food sources that we can rely on to provide us with iron include meat products, as well as cereal and beans. Next, we have calcium and magnesium. These two minerals play a role in muscle contraction. If you were at the first webinar, I mentioned briefly that calcium plays an important part in triggering the muscle contraction process, while magnesium is another mineral that's very important to the entire process. And like we learned from the last slide, you can get magnesium from green leafy vegetables. And if you have a deficiency in calcium or magnesium, something you might experience is that your muscles feel weak because the muscle contraction process is not functioning at its optimal condition. And as a result, your athletic performance might go down a little bit. Calcium and vitamin D. So these two micronutrients are important for bone health and muscle function. You might have heard or seen calcium and vitamin D mentioned all together pretty frequently. And the reason is because vitamin D has a function of helping our body absorb calcium. So this allows us to better maintain our bone health and our muscle function. And there are many foods and supplements out there from which we can get these two micronutrients. So calcium comes from dairy products, and then we can also get vitamin D from different foods and supplements. But we can also receive vitamin D from another unique source that doesn't involve consuming a food or supplement. If you think you know where we can get vitamin D from another source, you can type it into the chat and let's see if anyone has the correct answer. Okay, Tony and Evan, they said the sun, and that is correct. So you probably heard a lot of people talk about how it's important to get out in the sun for vitamin D, and that's definitely true. So for athletes and for everyone else in general, it's important to get outside frequently because it's one of the unique sources we can rely on to provide us with vitamin D. So then, as a result, we don't need to rely that much on consuming foods or supplements with vitamin D. Finally, we have B vitamins. These are important for energy production and red blood cell formation. Now, I did mention that micronutrients aren't usually supposed to be providing us with most of our energy, but the reason that we can say that B vitamins are important for energy is because if we have a deficiency in B vitamins, then our red blood cell formation is not at the best condition that it should be. This means that there's less red blood cells in our body. That's described by a term called anemia, Anemia. I'm sorry, it's not on the slide, but anemia is basically what happens when you have a deficiency in red blood cells. And becomes a problem because your red blood cells are needed during exercise, especially to deliver oxygen from your lungs to your muscles. So basically, if you have a deficiency in B vitamins, you have a deficiency in red blood cells, and then your muscles may not receive the oxygen they need, and then you might feel exhausted or having a lack of energy. So basically, indirectly, we need vitamin B in our diet to make sure that we don't have a lack of energy during exercise. And because there's so many different types of B vitamins that you might have noticed from the previous slide when I talked about all these different food sources and the different types of B vitamins, the most important thing to remember is that we should maintain a well-balanced diet to make sure that we have all of these B vitamins in our body. We can't really narrow it down to a short list of foods that we rely on for B vitamins. So in general, it's important to remember B vitamins come from various sources like meat products, dairy products, and vegetables. So the bottom line is that not just for B vitamins, for all of these micronutrients, it's important to keep our diet balanced and to have a little bit of everything to make sure that we are consuming all the nutrients that we need. Now, just to do a brief summary of what today's webinar was about, I first talked about macronutrients, which are the nutrients that we need in our body in very large amounts. And their main goal is to provide us with the energy that we need, especially when we do exercise and play sports. And specifically, carbs and fat are the two large nutrients that we rely on frequently for energy. And depending on the exercise that you do, you could be using carbs or fat for energy. If you're doing a high intensity exercise, for example, exercise that requires a lot of power or accelerates your heart rate a lot, for example, like if you lift weights or if you're sprinting, then carbohydrates are the main nutrient that you use for energy. If you're doing lower intensity exercise, then fat will be what you rely on for the most part for energy. Then I'd focus on protein with exercise. The reason is because that if you combine nutrition and exercise together, they are able to work more than they can do by themselves. They optimize your protein synthesis levels. So after you exercise, consuming protein can allow for protein synthesis levels to become elevated, and they go on to dominate the protein breakdown that you experience during exercise. And then at the end, this is important because protein synthesis is the process that we really want to focus on when our goal is to enhance or just to maintain our muscle size and muscle function. And then finally, I talked about micronutrients. There's a whole wide range of micronutrients, but the main takeaway is that in order to make sure that we're not deficient or lacking in any micronutrients, we should be maintaining a balanced diet consisting of meat products, dairy products, fruits, and vegetables. All right, that's it for this webinar on macronutrients and micronutrients. Does anyone have any questions for me? If you do, you can either unmute yourself or type it in the chat.
Kyle.
Yeah.
One question. You mentioned the Greek yogurt. What's the difference between Greek yogurt and other yogurts?
So I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube and I've read about Greek yogurt. I haven't seen much mention about regular yogurt. I think Greek yogurt is considered better because it has a higher protein content. Specifically, it has casein, which is a slower digesting protein. And something interesting I've seen is that the casein in Greek yogurt, if you consume it before you sleep, that would be a good choice because the protein digests slowly. So you can maintain protein synthesis levels while you're sleeping and while you're not taking in any more protein. But I guess the main reason that I mentioned Greek yogurt instead of regular yogurt is because that's what I've been seeing for the most part in my research, is that Greek yogurt is known for its high casein content, which is one of the high quality proteins.
Oh.
But in, obviously the Greek yogurt should not have that much sugar. Plain Greek yogurt is definitely better than other Greek yogurt with a lot of like sugary fruits in there.
Good information. Good information. So what you suggest is we eat protein. We eat protein after exercise is better, right?
Yeah. Another thing would be to if you didn't eat if you wake up like early in the morning and you exercise before you eat, it could also be helpful to have a little bit of protein before you eat. But generally, protein after exercise works pretty well if you did have like a meal or a sizable snack an hour or two before you start exercise.
Strained compared to regular yogurt.
All right. Yeah, so Tony said Greek yogurt is just strained compared to regular yogurt. So yeah, that would be one of the differences.
What is strained mean here?
Strained refers to basically it's just a process of like how they create it, I'm assuming. It's like when they strain something, it's like leaving a certain amount of the nutrients in there and taking out others. Um, so when they process the Greek yogurt, one of the things that they leave in there is the casein, which is the high quality protein, and then that's what makes Greek yogurt pretty effective as a protein source. Anyone have any other questions?
This is good. I learned so much.
Right. If no one else has any questions, I want to thank you guys so much for coming to today's webinar. I really hope you guys learned a lot about nutrition and exercise throughout these webinars. As always, if you are interested, feel free to check out my blog site. I've pasted the link into the chat for your reference. And if you end up having other questions or other topics you want to discuss with me afterwards, feel free to email me at my email on the slide, NutriAthletics2020@gmail.com. Another way you can contact me is by reaching out to my Instagram at Nutri_athletics. So these are just two convenient ways that I'll be available if you ever want to ask a question or just talk to me about anything related to nutrition and exercise. All right, so if no one else has questions.
I kind of have a question.
All right.
So yeah, so after we're done with this theory, and it's really helped, and at least helped me a lot. I'm sure for all the audience in your series helped and get some helpful knowledge for exercise. What you can do for help us in the future?
Yeah, good question. So after this webinar series, I think I want to start another series sort of thing, focusing more on exercise because I talked a lot about like energy and nutrients that we consume, but I think another important thing that I can share with other people is different types of exercise we can do, especially at home, not requiring to go out anywhere or anything. So I think I'll reach out to everyone who signed up for these webinars through email, and once I finish creating or planning my next series in this project, then I'll definitely send it out to everyone so that you guys can access and keep learning about nutrition and exercise.
So should that be pretty soon?
Yeah, in the next week or so.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yep. All right. Does anyone else have questions? All right. Thank you guys so much for coming today. I hope you guys learned a lot throughout this series. And as always, remember, you can check out my website. I'll be posting there more throughout the rest of the summer. And thank you guys for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Kyle.